History of the Donbass. Giuseppe Perri, CIERL, Brussels. With the collapse of the Tsarist Empire, an independent Ukrainian republic was proclaimed. But it was not recognized by the Bolsheviks, who made war. The existence of an autonomous or independent Ukraine was not part of their vision, as stated in June 1917 by Bolshevik leaders of Ukraine, Georgy Pyatakov, who said that Ukraine was not an economic separate region. The Donbass industrial development had made it the imperial region with the bigger metallurgical production and mining. But in 1913, only 15% of the imperial finished industry goods were produced in Ukraine, making its economy closer to colonial exploitation. That interconnection evoked by Pyatakov. On the other hand, the status of Ukraine in Tsarist times was that of a set of imperial provinces, the southwestern provinces, ruled by a representative of the emperor, and whose national identity was denied because there was talk of her as Little Russia. Ukrainian language was considered a dialect, and, after the Polish uprising of 1863, its use undergoes several prohibitions. To attract nationalities that were part of the Russian Empire, and in accordance with the principle enunciated by Lenin that this empire was a prison of peoples, an ambiguous policy on nationalities, called Korenizatsiya, or indigenization, was adopted during the first decade of Soviet power, ambiguous, because the aim was also to catalogue and manage the population according to a typical perspective of the colonial powers. Soviet 1924 constitution finally gave the central government more powers than expected, so that the Soviet republics have the same powers as the Russian regions. While the party was still centralized, university education continued to be given in Russian. The Ukrainian Bolshevik Party was dominated by Russians. Many were from the Donbass, but Lenin rejected the creation of an autonomous republic in the Donbass. Stalin, meanwhile, favored in particular Korenizatsiya for its alliances with key local Bolsheviks, also considered the centralizing tendencies of Trotsky and his other opponents. The direction of the Ukrainian Communist Party, led by the German Emanuel Kvyring, favorable to the secession of Donbass, and by his deputy Lebed, a Russian, was hostile to Korenizatsiya. Among Ukrainian government employees who were members of the party, only 18% knew Ukrainian. Only 10 to 15% of the documentation of the Ukrainian government was in Ukrainian. In 1923, a policy in favor of the Ukrainian language was then started, and in 1926, 30% of newspapers and 50% of the books published in Soviet Ukraine were published in Ukrainian. In 1927, the percentage of Ukrainians residing in Kiev was increased from 27 to 42%. The number of Ukrainian immigrants in the industrial cities of Donbass and southeastern Ukraine also increased. The Russian, however, continued to be in common use in factories. For the workers, there were no mandatory Ukrainian courses because Stalin feared losing the consent of the Donbass Russian-speaking working class, and Ukrainian immigrants of the campaign accepted the domination of Russian language in factories. The percentage of industry workers that used the Ukrainian language fluently in 1929 was only 32%. The Korenizatsiya therefore represented in the Donbass cities a complex phenomenon. Russian speakers have undergone a kind of linguistic shock by Ukrainization, and part of the Russians was determined to learn Ukrainian. Many peasants and Russified Ukrainian workers entered for the first time in touch with their culture and have become aware of their own nationality. While the Russian language remained dominant and continued the Russification process of urbanized Ukrainians, this complexity explains why, even today, many people in the Donbass remain unrelated to the national and linguistic clashes. In 1928, CIERL, a Pole of Donbass, which has never learned Ukrainian, was appointed first secretary of the Ukrainian Bolshevik Party, but the most important figure was however Mykola Skripnik, a Ukrainian, who defended the independence of the republics and Ukrainization. It will be driven to suicide in 1934, when Stalin put an end to Korenizatsiya, the application to extend the Ukrainianization to many Ukrainian minority in Russia and in the Cuban, more than 8 million people according to the 1926 census, and the claim of territorial changes in favor of the Republic of Ukraine occasioned the crisis of Korenizatsiya, a crisis that was also related to the forced collectivization of the agricultural sector, the statist obsession, that will have permanently weakened the peasant opposition to the Bolshevik power, to which is added a Ukrainophobia. Sakharov attributed to Stalin, led to the catastrophic famine of 1932–1933 in Ukraine, December 29, 1932. The Ukrainian Politburo was forced to issue a requisition order of the reserves of wheat belonging to the families. It was the beginning of the Great Famine, which involved at least 30 million people and led to the death from 3 million to 7 million of people, according to different estimates of researchers. The Holodomor, literally death by hunger, also decimated the Luhansk region, renamed Voroshilovgrad since 1935. Donetsk region was less affected. The emigration of many Russian families in Ukraine was favored, which would alter the demographic balance in these border regions. After World War II, the Russian immigration was favored. The number of Russians present in Ukraine increased from 4 million in 1939, 12% of the population, to 7 million in 1959, 16% of the total, as now, and 21.1% in 1979. For the first time in its history, the territory of Ukraine has become binational. In the Donbass, the number of Ukrainians decreased from 65.4% in 1926 to 53.7% in 1979, while the number of Russians grew from 25.7% to 43.4%. The Russification campaign under Brezhnev had important effects in Ukraine. Periodicals published in Ukrainian representing 46% fell to 19% between 1969 and 1980, while the books have fallen from 60 to 24% between 1958 and 1980. The number of Russian-speaking Ukrainians and the number of bilingual experienced a steady growth between 1959 and 1979. In the Donbass, non-Russian-speaking Ukrainians are past about 30 to 20%. In the Donbass, the lack of university until the second half of the 60s has contributed to this phenomenon, as there was no intellectual milieu able to keep the national culture. Therefore, in the Donbass, the Russification of Ukrainians in 1979 was 5 times higher than the national average. Data are only comparable to those of the city of Kiev and Crimea. However,